Archana Gilravi joins us from the Lean In organization, which is part of the Sheryl Sandberg and Dave Goldberg Family Foundation's Lean In organization. Lean In is a community partner of the Fourth Floor. Archana will be interviewed by Jo Piazza, who is an award-winning journalist, a digital strategist, and a best-selling author of 9 books that I think have been translated into 13 languages, or around that number, quite impressive. She's also the host and executive producer of the Committed podcast on iHeartMedia, as well as the host of the Fierce podcast. And she is also my very, very dear friend. So I will leave it now to you, Jo, to further introduce Archana and to get this conversation started.
Wonderful. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for the launch. And I want to start out by, I know everyone is on mute, but I think we should give a big round of applause to Breen, Sarah, and Kat for all of the amazing work that they have done on this launch. And also, it's sad that we can't be in person together. I think it's always important for us to acknowledge that when we're doing these strange Brady Bunch virtual things. I'm sad I can't see all of your faces, but we're here. And so many women have showed up today that it's amazing. I'm freaking blown away by how many people are here today. And I've spent most of my career as a journalist and as a nonfiction and fiction writer covering women and covering the different ways that women show up in the world, whether that be through politics, through celebrity, through finance. And I say this all the time in my stories and when I'm giving talks, that we can't solve a problem that we can't see. And so that's why I think it's so important that we're kicking off today with talking about why we're here. What does the world look like? What does the landscape look like for women? We know that women had been making incredible strides in the corporate workplace, and we still are. Let's not downplay that at all. But frankly, we also all know that the recent crisis pushed us back a little bit. And it's up to us, all of us here right now, to figure out what we're going to do after this inflection point. How can we use this current crisis to build back better for a corporate America for women, for a world that is more equal, for a world that is set up for women to get money, power, and control in the different companies that they are working with. And so to start this off, we are going to talk to Archana Gilravi from the Lean In organization. Lean In has always been one of my favorite places to go for both data and storytelling about what it means to be a woman in the workplace, where women in the workplace can be going and where we should be going. And so with that, I want to kick it off to Archana just a little bit to tell us where we're at right now, what the data is telling you guys, and where we can hopefully be going in the future. And also, since we're kicking off the summit today, what we should be talking about as we break off into these smaller chats.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Jo, and Breen and Kat for having me. I'm super excited for this launch and excited for this day. And so appreciate being able to spend a little bit of time with you. It's morning here in California, so this morning, and talking about this topic, which is very near and dear to my heart. So Jo, you mentioned kind of like what's been happening, what are we seeing? And so as Jo mentioned, Lean In has partnered with McKinsey for the last 6 years to produce a report called our Women in the Workplace Report. As far as we can tell, it's the largest study of its kind on the state of women in the workplace, and starts to really show the progress or lack thereof of what's happening in the US. Last year, 317 companies employing more than 12 million people participated. Historically, we've done kind of like the traditional, what does progress look like? What's the percentage of women at every step of the ladder? And what are some of the broader themes? And last year, we changed tactics a little bit because we really wanted to understand the impact that COVID was having on women. And just to provide some context, we launched these surveys and kind of got this data in May, kind of like April, May of last year. So, almost still before a lot of the real impacts that we were seeing when it came to childcare and when kids were going back to school. And then we're going to do another one this year that helps to kind of understand kind of how that's continuing. But one of the things that we found in the study last year, I think we had all heard the stories and read the articles on women struggling to really balance work and everything else, and kids being at home because of COVID. And what we found was that 1 in 4 women, so 25% of women, were considering downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce altogether. That is an incredibly disappointing number. That translates to millions of women, and it could wipe out all of the hard-earned progress that we've really seen for women, and especially women in management, in just 1 year. In particular, there were 3 groups of women that we know are facing distinct challenges. And the first is mothers. I think we all know that mothers are struggling, but it's even worse than we think. Mothers are doing more childcare and more housework than ever before. And on top of that, mothers are more worried than fathers that their performance at work is being judged negatively as a result of this. And honestly, they're right to worry. The research shows that we tend to assume that mothers are less committed, that they're less productive. It's got a term, it's called the motherhood penalty. And mothers were already dealing with it before COVID-19, and COVID-19 has really exacerbated it. I experienced this firsthand at the start of this year. We came back from the holidays, and our daycare called us kind of after the first. I've got a 2.5-year-old, and after the first day, they were like, "Hey, there was an adult who tested positive, so we've got to shut down the daycare for 2 weeks." And I'm really fortunate in that my parents live close by, and so we were able to manage with some help from the parents and taking a couple of days off. But I do think about a lot of the families who don't have that flexibility, don't have that luxury, and then are taking PTO time that they probably don't have, that they've already probably taken last year, in order to stay home with their children, and some real impacts that there's probably going to have in terms of performance reviews and careers, et cetera. The second group that's been hard hit is senior level women. And I know that there are a lot of senior level women in the audience today. And you all are under the same pressure to perform as senior level men, but you're up against a lot more. You face more demands at home. So we know that senior level women are more likely than women at other levels to be mothers. We also know that 2/3 of senior level women have a partner who also works for full time, and compare that to just 1/3 of senior level men. And that makes a huge difference when you have a partner who's able to kind of like take care of everything at home versus trying to manage a dual couple career. Senior level women are held to higher standards of performance. They're blamed for more of the failure. And they're also more likely than men at the same level to feel this pressure to work more or to be kind of always on. And so almost 3 in 4 senior level women cite burnout as one of the main reasons as to why they're considering downshifting their careers or leaving altogether. And the one thing to note about losing senior level women in leadership is that it actually hurts women and women of color at every level, kind of down the chain. Companies with more women in senior leadership perform better, they have better cultures, and senior level women are more likely than senior level men to be mentors, sponsors, and allies to women of color. So if we start to see that group go, we really start to see the group that's pulling others up leave the workforce, and that could have some real negative downstream implications. And then the last group that's having a significantly harder time are Black women. We know that from 6 years of our Women in the Workplace research that it's really hard to be a Black woman in corporate America. They face more barriers to advancement. They are promoted more slowly. For every 100 men promoted to manager, only 58 Black women are promoted, despite the fact that they ask for promotions at the same rate as men do. They get less support from managers and senior leaders. And they face a greater variety of microaggressions or bias in the workplace. So one example here is that Black women are 3 times more likely than white men to hear a coworker express surprise at their language skills or other abilities. And now Black women are having an even harder time, compounded on top of all of that, because the Black community is dealing with a disproportionate impact on COVID. The Black community is also dealing with the emotional toll of all the racist violence from last year. And then they're not getting the support that they need from managers in the workplace. So none of this is okay. And quite frankly, if companies want to do better by women, they really have to take a step back and do better by Black women.
One of the things that I want to point out is we learn so much from the kinds of surveys and reporting that you guys are doing. But it always strikes me every time that I listen to this data and to these stories about how much we don't talk about these things amongst ourselves, that we're willing to say on a survey, oh, I'm really afraid of burnout, or I'm working so much more than my partner, but we don't talk about it with each other. And I think that that is going to be one of the beautiful parts of this community, that we should feel like we're in a safe space, that we're in a place where we can talk about the things that we know are affecting our careers. We all know it. We're all going through it. And we should be able to voice those problems out loud and look for potential solutions from the women who have either been here before us or gone through something similar. And so I want to put that note out to the group today, as we're in the chat and as we're having more talks. Let's really talk about these problems and not just present them on the screen. Let's dig in with them. And to that point, what do you guys see as some of the potential solutions, as some of the things that we can be doing right now, literally like from very little things to gigantic big picture things?
Yeah, Jo, such a great question. And I'm going to split that out into kind of two elements, because I think that there are some things that companies can do to make sure that women aren't left behind as we come out of COVID. And then there are just some basic building blocks that all companies should be doing when it comes to DE&I, that are more than just checking the box. And it's shocking to me how few companies take this. So I probably am preaching to a group that knows this, but I'll set this there as food for thought as you all go back to your companies and try to influence ways in which they're thinking about coming out of COVID, in order to recover in a way that really is inclusive of women and inclusive of women of color more broadly. So let's start with the COVID piece of it. One of the things that we're seeing is that companies are not doing enough to address the root cause of burnout. And that's what kind of we're hearing in terms of why people are thinking about leaving the workforce. And I just want to acknowledge that companies should be acknowledging that nothing about work right now is business as usual. And so expectations of employees should also not be business as usual. And there are three ways in which companies can really think about this. I think that would make a meaningful difference. The first is fundamentally rethinking performance expectations for both 2020 and 2021, because we're not out of this yet. It's another year that we'll be having to really work through this. And so all of this applies to this year as well. And so companies should be asking, are the goals that we set in the pre-pandemic world, are they still reasonable? As we think about 2021 goals, how do we think about those, and what is reasonable in this world versus what we would do in like a typical kind of like run-of-the-mill world? So should there be differences this year? How are we reducing workload, extending timelines, et cetera? And then the second thing is decoupling compensation from performance ratings. A lot of companies tie that, and I understand that. I think that makes a lot of sense. But in this world where everyone is going through a pandemic, really decoupling that and taking that pressure off, I think would be very helpful for everyone. And I am concerned about performance expectations. Like, I do wonder this year how much the motherhood penalty are going to affect women. And I think for kind of like all the women in the audience, if you feel like you are being penalized for having to take time to take care of kind of whether it's a sick family member due to COVID or childcare issues or whatnot, really push back and ask questions, kind of like really understand where the rating is coming from. If you think is unfair, I would say just like I think it's a group of very powerful women, but just don't just take that and don't accept it for what it is. Kind of like really start to push back if you feel like there's bias kind of creeping in there. I think the second thing that companies can do is embracing flexible working norms. Part of working from home, there's amazing elements about working from home. I used to have a 90-minute commute. I don't anymore. It's lovely. And so there are some really nice things about that. But on the flip side, we are hearing from women that they report feeling always on. And so companies can set some simple things to set established hours for meetings, no meetings past 5 p.m., putting policies in place for responding to emails outside of typical business hours, things that we would naturally do when everybody was in more of an office workload and an office mode. So just setting some norms there that can help people, both men and women, not feel like they're having to be always on. And then the third thing, which should happen regardless COVID or not, is really focusing on creating an inclusive workplace for Black women and supporting Black women. Having a no tolerance policy for discrimination, providing allyship or unconscious bias training for everyone in the organization, and being vocal about it, explicitly saying to your employees that this is going to be a focus and this is what we're doing about it. So that's what I'll say kind of coming out of COVID. In addition to some of the kind of like basic building blocks that are just reminders, because I do think that this is a very smart group of women who probably already know this, but there are a couple of things that we know work. And the first is setting hiring and promotion targets at the intersection of race and gender and other aspects of identity, and holding leaders accountable for that progress. So what we find in the research is that only 38% of companies set targets by gender, and only 10% of companies set targets for race and gender combined. So when you don't set targets by race and gender, what happens is that a lot of white women get promoted, kind of leaving women of color behind. And so this is why it's really important for companies to set targets by race and gender so that we can have all women rising up. There was a recent report that, Jo, you may have seen from the National Women's Law Center, which is another phenomenal organization that produces great research and great data, that shows that Black and Latinx women accounted for almost all of the 140,000 jobs that we lost in December. Like, that's a pretty massive number. And so I think this goes back to, if we don't set those targets by race and gender, Black and Latinx women will get hit the hardest as we try to recover from this, from COVID, and in a really equitable way. The second is, oh, go ahead, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, as you're talking about setting targets, it's something we talk about a lot, but we talked about earlier that it's important not just to check boxes either. So how are we making sure that there's meaningful change as opposed to diversity box checking, which we have seen a lot of in the past year?
Yeah, I actually don't think that setting targets is diversity box checking. Because if you're setting targets and then you're meeting those targets and you're holding leaders accountable for reaching those targets, there's one thing if you're setting targets and then you don't do anything about it. But I think what setting targets do, it's like any other business metric, because then you have to look at the systems in place. Like, you can't set a target that says, half of my management team is going to be women and then do nothing about it. You then have to take a look at, well, what are your hiring practices and where are you hiring from? Do you have a strategy around hiring from HBCUs? Do you have a strategy on, like, where are you posting the job boards? How much are you relying on your network? So what I think that setting target does, it actually forces organizations to look at all the systems in place when it comes to hiring and promotions to really start to increase those numbers. Now, you're right. Like, I think numbers are one part of it. So that's kind of the, how do we get more women and more women of color kind of into the organization? And the second is more of like a belonging. How do we know that once we have them there, do they feel welcome? Do they feel included, et cetera? And I think that's really important. And what I would say for that is there are a lot of different strategies there. I think companies are doing kind of employee resource groups, which I know helps. The other piece is actually putting managers and everyone at the company through some kind of unconscious bias training. We see that I think 70% of women say that they've experienced some kind of microaggression or bias in the workplace, but only 30% of employees say that they've seen it. So you've got this gap around people not even knowing what bias looks like, and not knowing that they're kind of perpetrating that, and others being like, this happens to me, and it's really not a kind workplace. So at Lean In, we actually offer a free unconscious bias training program called 50 Ways to Fight Bias, which talks about the very specific ways in which bias shows up on a daily basis. And on March 3rd, we're launching a whole new set of cards. And so we'll have over 100 situations. And one of the things that I love about this program are two things. One is how specific it is. So you can have conversations with others. And it kind of gives you ideas on what to say if you see it happen. So what can you do as an ally? So if you overhear a colleague say, oh, I think she only got promoted because she was a Black woman, which we have seen in the research and the data. As an ally, you can step in and ask a thoughtful question, being like, oh, that's interesting. Like, why do you say that? Here are all the things that she did in the last year. Like, I think she really deserves it. And so how are you kind of like showing up as an ally? How are you having some of the hard conversations? And the cards really facilitate that. The second thing that I love is that it's highly intersectional. So we actually do focus on what the research shows that Black women face, Latinx women, women with disabilities, Native American women, Muslim women, Asian women. I'm forgetting a couple of the identities, but we went very broad in the identities. And I really do like that because different groups experience bias in different ways. And we thought it was really important to shine a light on that. And then the last piece I'll say, Jo, is, a lot of companies focus on the percentages of women at senior level. And that's really, really important. And that's where we've seen a lot of the progress being made, right? So that's been really good. But where companies should really look at and start to put some programs in place is at that first step up to manager. When you're going from an individual contributor to a manager, that happens relatively early on in one's career. And what we see is that's where women are being left out. And that's where women of color are being left out. So for every 100 men that are promoted to manager, 80 white women are promoted, 71 Latinx women are promoted, and 58 Black women are promoted. This is your future pipeline of leaders. Like, this is the future leadership of your company. And this is where a lot of resources and training and investment dollars really get put in place, is that first line of manager. And so if we're not promoting women to that first line of manager, you're already setting them up for failure, kind of like across the rest of their career.
I love what you said about accountability, because I think targets are wonderful as long as there is that accountability, following up with them. And what we've seen in a lot of companies is there hasn't been that
That's
kind
right.
of accountability. So it leads me to one of Fourth Floor's huge missions, which is getting more women and people of color on these board seats, because board seats are so paramount and board members are so paramount in forcing a company to have accountability. And that's the kind of thing that you can genuinely influence when you're in that room. And right now we
absolutely
don't have those people in the room.
Yeah, Jo, I think that's great, because as a board member, you can ask the CEO, what is your DE&I strategy? I want to see the numbers. These numbers are not sufficient enough. What are you doing? What programs are you to have in place? You can ask the tough questions as a board member to make sure that that kind of like DE&I and gender diversity and racial diversity is really important and front and center. So I love that, Jo, and I think that's something that women who sit on board seats can absolutely do and start to change the conversation in that room.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to end our conversation with a little bit of hope and a little bit of happiness, because I genuinely believe that crises can be an inflection point. That this could be, not necessarily, even though, yes, 2020 was a dumpster fire, but it could be a dumpster fire that could lead to something freaking amazing. So how can we seize this opportunity? What are these moments of hope? And what should we be excited about for 2021?
Yes, it's such a good question, Jo, because I think if you get mired into the data, it can feel very hopeless. And you start to hear all the stories about this women, and you're just like, it just feels like can't catch a break and can't really move on. So look, I think a couple of things. I think the research clearly shows that diverse teams are more innovative, they're more productive, they perform better, and they realize higher profits. I think we can all know that. And I think that while COVID was incredibly challenging and it has some of these troubling insights, I would see there's two silver linings that I see. I hate to say that I wish there were more. There's only two that I can see right now that I have like a lot of questions. But the first is that I'm excited about the future of remote work. One of the things that we think we've all seen is, and what companies are telling us, so 93% of companies say that more jobs can be performed remotely. I think we all inherently knew that, but companies are kind of coming around to, people will still be productive if they work from home. And 70% of companies say that more remote work will actually allow them to increase diversity in their hiring, because you can hire from other cities, you can have more geographic diversity. It really allows for greater flexibility. Which is fantastic. And so but I still think there's some open questions. How does this play out for women with disabilities, women with other family care responsibilities, and women who couldn't do roles initially due to travel and long commutes? I know a lot of women in sales who don't love the Monday through Thursday traveling, especially in tech sales. And so does this actually open up some more of those lucrative jobs for more women? So I think that's an area where we could see a lot of hope to really level that playing field. We're also starting to see signs of a more empathetic workplace. I think people feel more human human right now. You know, I do have this background up, but usually I don't. And so, you know, you really start to see where people live and how they live, and kids, you know, running in and out of Zoom meetings. And so it really humanizes people. And then from a policy standpoint, what we've seen is that many companies have expanded their mental health counseling. A large number of companies are investing in mental health and well-being. And again, I think employers and managers are they're just seeing the human side of work, which I think is really positive. So, you know, I think those two things are great. And honestly, you know, not to get too political here, but, you know, with the new administration being sworn in and the number of policies that we've seen changed, even in the first few days, like that does bring me hope. I do think this administration really cares. I was reading an article this morning where the new, I think, defense secretary really started looking at policies around sexual assault in the military. And that's something that had really stopped over the last administration. Biden and Harris announced a new gender council to be put in place. And this is a council that was disbanded during the last administration. And so, yeah, I do think I have more hope on companies and government. I think COVID in some ways has really shone a light on the areas of our system that's broken, like childcare, like family care, and then the burden that really puts on women, and it exacerbated it in such a way that really forces people to take a step back and think through, okay, how do we reimagine these? And so I have to have hope. I have to have hope that there is it's a new year and it's a new administration, and there are some early indications that things are starting to head in the right direction. And so, you know, I think that's what I would leave all of you with in terms of, as you go through this incredible day that Breen and Kat have set up for you, is, you know, how are you able to take these learnings, kind of like being senior women in your organizations, and start to influence within those organizations, and kind of hoping that what we're able to do at the company level kind of can start to marry with what we are able to do at a government level, and really bring those two things together.
And speaking of the human side of things, you guys are probably just about to hear my baby, because she's just waking up and she's right in the next room. And I'm just going to ignore her for like a minute while we I don't feel bad. She can occupy herself in there. But no, I think that this moment is exciting, and we should feel this hope, and we should feel this kind of optimism. And really quick, my last question, because we do only have 2 minutes, and I should probably, you know, be a mother for a little bit. But what will the world look like if we can implement these kinds of things? What are the good things that we will see if we take advantage of this moment?
Yeah. I mean, all sorts of things. Like, I just think we see a more equal world. We see a world where more women are in leadership across the board. We see a world where more women are creating wealth for their families. We see a world where women have more choices, and can decide what it is that they want to do. We see a world where women are not as stressed when it comes to trying to like do it all and have it all and kind of like do all of the things. I think I saw a stat somewhere, I'm forgetting it. There's some kind of, you know, if you had women participate in the labor force, just like you had men participate in the labor force, I mean, there are trillions of dollars that you could add to the GDP kind of moving forward. And so I do see, I think there's just like so many benefits in terms of different decisions happen when you have more women in leadership and when you have more women in power. And so I think that is what, that's what we can start to see moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, we want choices, right? And no matter what those choices are, we want access, and we want access to that wealth and that power, and we want things to be more fair than they were before. I don't think any of this is a big ask. No,
not at all.
Nope, it's just what we deserve. I am going to pass this on to our next panel, but thank you for being here to kick off the summit today and having this chat, and, you know, just telling us the story of where we're at, but then instilling us with some hope that we all need right now.
Jo, thanks so much for having me. This was great. And Breen, thanks so much for having me too. This was really delightful this morning. So appreciate it.
Seriously, thank you both so much. Just a fantastic conversation. So thank you for kicking us off this morning. I really appreciate it. Big thank you to both.
Fantastic. Enjoy the rest of your day.